OTAs are here and everybody knows that practice makes perfect. So, of course, it's the best time of the year.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. AKA. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Been podcasting on Locked On Falcons for almost a decade. Been podcasting on previous incarnations before it was Locked On Falcons for half a decade prior to it becoming Locked On Falcons. So it's been almost 15 years. And I appreciate each and every one of you, whether you were listening to those previous incarnations, all 2 of you, or, you're just recently discovering how incredible this podcast can be. And I appreciate all of you that are everydayers, whether you're old or new. And all you have to do to become an everydayer and make this podcast your first listen each and every day is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are joined by Will McFadden of AtlantaFalcons.com to talk about this early portion of the offseason with OTAs, all that's in store. So without further ado, let's jump into that conversation right now. All right, everyone, we are back for another illustrious episode with an illustrious guest. He is the senior editor of AtlantaFalcons.com, as well as the host of the Falcons Final Whistle. He is Will McFadden, longtime reoccurring guest here on Locked On Falcons. And, we're kicking off OTAs, and who better to have on than Will McFadden, the voice of reason, the voice of positivity when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons, at least relative to yours truly, to sort of balance out all the negativity on this podcast. But Will, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, Aaron, thank you for having me, first of all, but it's so interesting hearing you have or introduce me like that, because it reminds me of our very first, I think, podcast together with you, me, Alan, and it was before the 2016 season. And I'm sure even in that one, I was the most optimistic of all of us, but I was like, I think this is a 6-10 team or whatever I had. And then lo and behold, what they do that year. But yeah, it's funny how now, and rightfully so, I've become the optimistic guy, but I started out kind of predicting a losing season for the Falcons with you.
Yeah. And I don't want to put that burden on you, Will, as the voice of positivity, but,
It's not a burden, my friend. It's natural. I come by it honestly.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, things going on in Atlanta, the kicking off OTAs, and we got a couple of more of these sessions in the coming weeks before the mandatory minicamp. And certainly later today, we'll talk about, whether a certain person is going to show up for these mandatory minicamps because he is not showing up for the voluntary portion. And we'll talk about that sort of aspect that always gets a lot of buzz this time of year. But, one of the things I am infamous for is I don't spend that much time talking about practice here on this podcast. But I'm curious when you're, whether it's in the building talking to Tori and Taryn and everybody else, or on the practice field, whether it's a cold, wet, rainy day or it's a hot, muggy day. What's motivating you, Will, through this portion of the off season? I was telling the other day on the podcast, it's like if you were to put a progress bar based off of where today is to where we'll be at the start of the season, we're like 2% of the way there. So I'm curious, with that sort of perspective, do you share that sort of perspective? We're at the very beginning of things. What is there to accomplish this time of year? What is the things that matter to you at this portion in the calendar year for a team like the Atlanta Falcons?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And personally, this is kind of my favorite time of the year, because the part of the game that really fascinates me is the coaching elements of football, right? I'm fascinated by schematics. How do you build and form an identity while getting 53 people aligned? Like, it's leadership, but it's also like science. And then it's also experimentation and rehearsal and practice. It's everything. It combines a little bit of all of it. And really, this is the time of year when the coaching, I think, is felt, and the plan that you create, how do you react to what you learned last season and saw around the league that maybe you'd never seen before? How do you prevent yourself from overreacting? How do you stay ahead of the curve in your own way? Like, all of these are the things that this time of year I'm trying to think about. And it's what honestly makes it so interesting to even just go talk to tight ends coach Kevin Coker, right? It's like, what little nugget can I get from you in an availability that we talk for 5-10 minutes? But it's just kind of hearing the way that they're thinking about the game and hearing the way that they feel their team can kind of make its stamp on the league, but then also how are you counteracting some of the trends that we see other teams creating or buying into? So that's kind of this time of year. And then of course you've got all the extraneous like storylines involving quarterback positions or free agency or the draft, all of that stuff that kind of is the lower hanging fruit to keep us on the pipeline. But I am really interested in the down period because it is the busy time for the coaches. Because once you get into the season, it is just every single day you're following routine, you're in a schedule, it is very regimented, and you're white knuckling kind of through a 17-game season. But right now is when the creativity comes to kind of like the forefront.
Okay. Well, I saw a 4-second clip of Michael Penix missing a throw. So how panicked should I be about the upcoming season, Will?
Oh, you should. It's over. Okay. Honestly, it's over before it even started, Aaron. No, that was. I think it is fair to say, in my opinion, watching him yesterday, like it was not the cleanest day from Michael Penix. But like you mentioned, it was cold. It was weirdly cold. It was muggy and drizzly and just kind of weird. So it sounds like I'm making excuses for him. In all honesty, he may have just had a sloppy day on the very first OTA practice. It happens, right? So no, I wouldn't panic. But I'm sure we'll get into Michael Penix a little bit more.
So we're going to talk more about Michael Penix. We got a pump here on this illustrious podcast with Will McFadden as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the NBA playoffs are in full swing with conference finals nearing the end, and we're potentially at the NBA finals, and it's the perfect time to head on over to FanDuel to sign up, not only so that you can win big as you watch the Thunder and the Pacers, whoever winds up winning it all, who knows at this point in time, nothing's confirmed at this stage, but they win big, you win big by going over to FanDuel.com. And when you place your first $5 bet, if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets that you can use on anything, right? That $5 bet can come on anything. Whether you think it's going to be who's going to make it to the NBA finals, who's going to win a game straight up, who's going to drop 25 in a night, who's going to get over under 6.5 rebounds in a game, who's going to get that first bucket in a game. There's so many ways to win big at FanDuel, whether it's basketball, football, or baseball, or high-a-lie, whatever tickles your fancy, you can find it over at FanDuel. And again, when you place that first $5 bet and it wins, you get $200 in bonus bets. So make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Let's get into that conversation with Michael Penix. And, much is made of sort of him kind of taking the reins of this team, the sort of quiet confidence. I've heard that phrase many, many times over the last, 48 hours or so when talking about Michael Penix, whether it's from reporters, whether it's from his teammates and whatnot. So what is your take on sort of this sort of beginning of the Michael Penix era of the Atlanta Falcons?
Yeah, quiet confidence, athletic arrogance. We in the media love a phrase when we hear something that even sounds like alliteration. Be prepared to hear it over and over again. I think, for first and foremost, he immediately, just by nature of being on your roster, puts you in the upper echelon of what you're even able to imagine with your offense because of his arm talent, right? And I think that sometimes that phrase gets overused, but I said it immediately on Believe in Falcons with Joe Patrick when the pick was made. Not even working inside of the building or anything like that. It's just like, he's Matthew Stafford. That's kind of what they see in him, is coming from LA. he is that type of natural thrower of the football, and the zip and pop that it has when it leaves his hand is real, and you can feel it. So that right there automatically, I think, puts you ahead of other teams when you're just able to create an offense. Like, you can just kind of touch all parts of the field, and that makes you naturally dangerous. So that's kind of why I'm willing to say, sure, like a missed out route, that's going to happen. But like, when you also see him fit it into the tightest of windows down the left sideline against Carolina, like, that's also going to happen. And that is the thing that I think most people should be excited by instead of harping on a miss here or there. But Aaron, I'll tell you, one of the things I noticed yesterday that I don't think I had seen before that I really wanted to see was some of the touch that he was putting on these shorter throws. Now keep in mind, this is all literally against air. They're just running routes. It's like as easy as it could get for these guys. But the ball was not just firing off of his hand with every single throw. He was varying the pace that he was putting on it. And I think that's an important step for a player who has that incredible arm strength. But some of the downside of that can be, hey, I'm peppering these guys when they're 3 yards in front of me, and it's leading to drops. So that was, I think, important to see. But there's only so much we can gain out there right now. I think training camp will be the real assessment of Penix.
Yeah, I remember watching Penix at the Senior Bowl, and it was one of the reasons why, when the Falcons drafted him, I didn't make as much about the arm strength, because I thought in those practices he was, trying to throw with more touch and timing than necessarily I'm going to rip this throw through your chest. As I saw another player at the Senior Bowl doing that, named Joe Milton, who's now with the Dallas Cowboys. And so, like, that's why, I know last year I didn't make a big deal about the arm strength, but, as we saw in the games, it certainly is an asset for this team. And certainly, I think, as you mentioned, Will, the goal is to make defenses defend every blade of grass. And it's harder to, the more space that defenses have to defend, the harder it is going to be. And so I agree with you when it comes to opening up what this Falcons offense has the potential to be. Now, when we look ahead to training camp, where I think the practices and all the things that are going on a daily basis are going to be a little bit more meaningful than, where we are at this stage in the offseason. Again, the sort of 2% progress bar in meter. Are there things that you're seeing now that you're, maybe planting seeds, right, for later, that you'll be like, that second week in August, like, oh, that was something I noticed in late May. An example of maybe what I'm talking about is last year, during the early portion of the offseason, Mike Hughes was getting all the reps with the ones. And I know there was a big talk during that portion of the offseason and up until the regular season of who's going to start opposite AJ Terrell. And that was something I made note of, where I was like, yeah, it makes sense that Mike Hughes would be sort of the front runner. And given what you expect from this coaching staff with the off coverage and needing to tackle, like, Mike Hughes probably should be considered the front runner for that starting job, at least in week 1. And we'll see if he plays at a level to maintain that. And I think he did. Are there things like that you're taking notice of when you're watching practice and you're like, I wonder if this is going to be a little bit more meaningful in 2 months from now than it may be at this point in time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because that is really what this time of the year is for, right? It is kind of those little tiny nuggets of information, because the first one I'll give you, right, that I noticed yesterday, but with the big caveat of like, who knows if this even means anything, is that I saw a few plays with like Tyler Allgeier and Bijan on the field at the same time. But like, why wouldn't you have that out there? Like, that's the other part of this, is that in talking to Zach Robinson and TJ Yates, it's like, this is the time to experiment with some things. So just because we see it out there, sure, they may line up in the Bear defense. Like, they may literally just be like, what does this look like? Right. So that's why I also love this time of year. But I did notice that. I think that this is a little bit more real in a sense, and it goes with the arm strength part with Michael Penix, is I think you're going to see more designed downfield combinations in these routes than maybe you did previously. And I'm thinking back to kind of that like Sark, Shanahan, Yankee concept where you have Julio kind of running that 20-yard like out with so like that type of stuff, because you really, again, want to maximize his arm strength. You need receivers that can maximize it, but then, you need vice versa. So that was another real thing is I just kind of noticed, I thought some of the routes looked a little bit deeper. A couple of offseason additions, one a little bit more well-known. I think Divine Diablo is going to be a factor for this defense in kind of a nice way. I liked what I saw from him yesterday. He kind of slid right in there as more of a veteran that I even anticipated him to be. Was never in the wrong spot, fast to react. And then I think Tegan Quitoriano, the tight end, kind of free agent offseason addition. Don't think he's going to suddenly turn into Travis Kelce out there for Atlanta, but I do think kind of the way Charlie Warner was like an under the radar, like if you know how impactful he was last year kind of guy. I could see a smaller version of that for I'm just going to say TQ, I think, from now on, even though there's a Taquan Graham already. But so those were a few. I'm trying to think. Kadero Hodge was getting a good bit of run, but again, I didn't notice Ray McLeod out there too much. So like he may not have been practicing all that fully. But I like, he's been here. He's not injured or anything like that. So don't take anything, run with that. But it like, those are the nuggets, right? It's kind of Kadero Hodge getting some run, Tegan getting out there a little bit more. That's kind of what I've seen in terms of anything that's going to be real and tangible. That's different. Again, I kind of think the first couple of weeks of training camp, ask me then, and I'll probably have some real insights for you. But like Rook has been running with kind of like the first team guys, which is what we expected. They started the rookies off on second string at the highest. Xavier Watts looks like he can play. Excited for him. His speed, Aaron, was like, I can't tell if it's because he legitimately moves just quicker than maybe his timing would have suggested, or if his anticipation allows it. So it's like that field speed versus test speed. His field speed popped to me yesterday, man. So like I'm excited to see that.
Yeah. Always appreciate those nuggets, especially the Tegan Quitoriano, the TQ nugget. There's going to be a battle for tight end
right?
3.
Sorry.
and I always love my third string position battles. Like I could make so many podcasts about that, and certainly when we get to August, I will be spending quite a bit of time talking about that. And so those little nuggets are the things I appreciate from you, Will. But obviously, with Michael Penix and we later in the summer we usually get more deeply into sort of the breakout candidates, but it's still early. Let's talk about some of those guys that you are seeing bigger things from in 2025, whether it's the obvious options or, maybe a sleeper or two that you're keeping your eye on.
Yeah, this is a weird year for that, because I think a lot of the guys that we know, and especially offensively, right? Because I think that's where a lot of breakout candidates naturally would come from. It's going to be who's a receiving back that maybe we think is going to really pop on third down, or who's that third receiver that could make a leap. But this offense, the Sean McVay offense, relies heavily on your top two. Drake and Darnell, those aren't breakout candidate guys. Tyler Allgeier, we know what he is. Bijan, we know what he is. I don't think Charlie Warner is necessarily getting 700 yards this season. So
bold take.
Defensively, I think that you're looking kind of at those second-year defensive lineman guys for me, because they need them to be breakout players, right? And I think everybody is kind of optimistic alongside me with Rook. So I'm going to talk about Brandon Dorlus a little bit, because he is a player that, honestly, I've been surprised with the way that they have talked about him this offseason. I wondered if they were going to make him, kind of bulk him up a little bit, slide him inside, and see if he could be a type of replacement for a Grady or maybe David Onyemata in the future when that time comes. So to hear that he's actually kind of going in the opposite direction, and they're making him this big end with versatility, and maybe he's part of your power package or your run package, is interesting to me, because I do think he still offers you some nice violent upside in the pass rush. Like that is an element of his game that I actually think will benefit from kind of this change in maybe the way that his role is envisioned. And it gets me thinking about the different options around him. So I think that that's a player I would put in there. If he's out there and he's healthy and they have a nice role for him, actually, I'll give you two guys who fit that exact category: Kevin King and DeMarcco Hellams. I think one of those two guys are going to carve out a nice, interesting, unique little role in this defense as your big nickel almost, because that is part of the defense that I think we started to see with Dan Quinn when you had DeMonte Casey, Ricardo Allen, and Keanu Neal was kind of three safety hybrid approach. And you now have players, whether it's Billy Bowman, whether it's Xavier Watts, Jesse Bates, DeMarcco Hellams, then you throw in all your nickel guys. That's a group that can kind of play up and back and do a lot of different things. So Kevin King and DeMarcco Hellams, I think, are two players that fit the mold of like an interesting hybrid jack, like of all trades type of player for this defense. And I trust the coaching staff to use them well. So I'll give you those three on the defense.
Okay. Always interesting to pick people's brains on sort of players that, they're like, oh, I could see this guy sort of flying under the radar and having a bigger year. And it's always fascinating. And you talk to enough people, all 53 guys are going to wind up getting picked eventually, but it is always interesting to sort of see, and then sort of seeing which are the names that are reoccurring. So I appreciate you, Will, for, giving that insight, and we'll see sort of, we'll put tally marks beside each one of these guys as they come up over the summer. But,
does Arnold, sorry, Aaron, does Arnold Ebiketie even count? Like, what would you do if I had said Arnold Ebiketie?
I would have been like, I'm backing you, because I feel like Arnold Ebiketie, because it's understandable because of the excitement around Jalen Walker and James Pierce, is kind of going from an obvious candidate to a not so obvious candidate, and it's kind of flying under the radar as a guy that could very easily lead the Falcons in sacks and pressures this year, but like no one's really talking about it.
And I guess that would be a breakout season. So yeah, he fits. Cool.
Yeah. So it's a good problem to have. Too many pass rushers. Not a problem the Falcons have had too often in the last couple of years. So
it's a new problem, but hey, we'll take it.
We'll take it. Yes, we will absolutely take it. As opposed to what we have been forced to take the last 20 years. So Will, I want to wrap up, because every time I have a guest on this podcast, it's the only time I feel like talking about Kirk Cousins. So let's talk about Kirk Cousins, and we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. This is the voluntary portion of the offseason. Still a week or two away from when things get mandatory. It's always fascinating to me that every time this year people make a big deal about who shows up and who doesn't show up, and I'm just like, don't y'all know that every Hall of Fame player never shows up for the voluntary? It's kind of one of those things. It's like there's no correlation to player success and whether or not you show up for the voluntary portion of the workout. But much was made on Kirk Cousins is not a rival. We've seen Kirk Cousins in and out of the building at earlier portions in the offseason. And so I'm basically going to ask you, Will, what do you think the future of Kirk Cousins is here in Atlanta? And if hypothetically I was to have you on the podcast in, say, mid-September, are we still talking about Kirk Cousins being an Atlanta Falcon at that stage in the season?
I think we are. I think Kirk Cousins is still an Atlanta Falcon. I hope we're not talking about it. Would be the answer. But yeah, I mean, at this point in time, it's just a big old fat mess of the same, dude. Like it is exactly as it's been day one. It feels like day 327. You just like put a little ticker up there on the screen, count it down. But it is, they're comfortable with him being the backup quarterback. That's how they're proceeding. The more it goes that way, like you can start to sell yourself on the reasons for. There are still the known reasons against, but also we've passed kind of the opportunity for the Falcons to do anything with that financial flexibility anyway. So, hey, like if this is a season that is very important, having a very capable quarterback, having two of them, that's great. That's awesome. So that's kind of how I think they feel about it. It's why they've said they're comfortable. And, Kirk, all the coaches I've talked to have said they don't expect him to be an issue if it kind of goes into the season with this dynamic. They've praised how he handled everything last year, even after taking that benching. And again, like, I will continue to try to give him praise every chance I get for the way he handled it with the media afterwards. There's not many people that would stand up there after you get benched and then like take questions. So I do think he has the right makeup. I'm not going to speak for what he wants or like his side of all of this. So as of now, he's Atlanta Falcons backup quarterback. That's how the team views it, and that's how they're going to continue to view it. Again, even if things will get interesting once we get to mandatory stuff, but right now it's voluntary. That's always been kind of the team stance. So
yeah, you're right. They said, and Terry said it the week after the season ended, they're comfortable with him being the backup quarterback. I did not believe him at the time when he said it. I don't think many people believed him at the time when he said it.
I personally didn't either.
Yeah, it took 3 months to wrap the head around, like, did Terry mean what he said when he said this? And, now we've had roughly 2 months to understand that, yes, Terry did mean what he said when he said that. So we'll see what's what with Kirk Cousins. Won't be the last time we talk about Kirk Cousins here on the podcast. But
and there are benefits, Aaron. Like, the benefit that like Michael Penix got last year working against Atlanta's first team defense on some of those scout teams, like, they're now going to get to operate against Kirk Cousins potentially every single day in practice. Like, that's going to be some pretty good on every single day training for these rookies, for young players that you're expecting to kind of step up. Like, that's a real intangible thing too, that we just would never discuss. Cause like, why would we? It's a practice squad, like, kind of rep, but like, that's who you're going against. So
yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. As we say, well, always looking on the bright side. I appreciate you for this is why we have you on this podcast. Cause
don't test my ability to spin, man. I can do it.
Oh man, I would have never thought of putting a positive spin on Kirk Cousins. But you're right. You're absolutely right. That is 100% true. So again, always appreciate that type of insight that Will McFadden can only bring. And when people are looking for that type of insight, let the listeners know where they can find that type of insight elsewhere beyond the Locked On Falcons podcast.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's always a pleasure to join you, Aaron, because you do bring out the best in me. I think you can follow me on Twitter at Will McFadden. You can, of course, read my work, the work of Tori McElhaney and Taryn Walk, excellent coverage at AtlantaFalcons.com. And you can hear me on the Atlanta Falcons Podcast Network. So it was, again, a real pleasure, Aaron. I always love coming on your show.
All right, man. I always appreciate you having it. I always appreciate having you on. And I look forward to future conversations later this summer, as well as hopefully during the course of a very successful 2025 Atlanta Falcons season. And we can, remember when people were complaining about that one high throw that Michael Penix had in late May, he ain't missing high throws like that in October, November, and December, and then ultimately January. So I'm looking forward to those conversations with you, Will. So that's going to do it for us here, guys. Thanks to Will McFadden of AtlantaFalcons.com for sharing his insights into this voluntary portion of the offseason. We'll get Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta's insight into this same portion of the offseason tomorrow on Locked On Falcons. So continue to make this podcast your first listen by subscribing and following for free on YouTube to check us out. And for your second listen, same places, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube for your second listen, which should be the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs, giving you the insights into all 32 teams and how they've built their roster and challenges ahead for them the upcoming season in the lead up to training camp. It's all available for you as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.